You know that feeling when everything finally falls into place, like a long, hard road suddenly ends on a flat, warm, sun-drenched porch where the air smells of hope and new life. That's exactly how I felt, standing in the middle of my brand new, freshly painted apartment after 6 long, intense years of hard work that seemed like they would never end. The floors were shiny, the walls were empty, but already breathing life, and I could finally allow myself to exhale and say out loud to myself, "This is my home, my name is Julie, I am 29 years old, and this is my story, the story of how patience, pain, hardship and love brought me to where I stand now, between my own 4 walls." I remember the day I got promoted as if it were yesterday, although in fact 2 years have passed. It was a normal working Tuesday, no hint of change until my boss, Mr. Carlson, called me into his office. My heart sank into my boots, certain that I had done something wrong. He rarely called anyone. Without warning, I walked down the hallway, my palms sweating and my stomach nodding, convincing myself with each passing second that this was the end of my career. But when I walked in, he looked up from his desk and handed me a contract, a document that would change my life. The salary in it was significantly higher than I could have dreamed of. I remember feeling a wave wash over me, not of joy, but of determination. From that day on, I lived like a monk, no expensive dresses, no evening get-togethers in restaurants with colleagues, no spontaneous weekend trips. Every cent, every drop of coffee I allowed myself, everything was subordinated to one goal: to save, to accumulate, to build. I'll be honest, my savings were important, but it was one event that made it possible for me to stand in this apartment now. A year ago, my grandmother Margaret, my mother's mother, passed away. She was more than just a grandmother to me, she was the one person who never let me forget that I was important, that I was not alone. When she died, in her will, she left me $150,000. This money, along with what I had saved over the years of my frugal life, allowed me to stop dreaming and finally start looking for a place to live. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy! When I first saw this 2-room apartment, my heart began to beat differently. It was exactly as I imagined it, not too big to feel lonely, and not too small to feel like a cage. Everything was perfect. The light from the window filled the room with soft morning light, and the kitchen, although simple, seemed created for baking pies, brewing tea, and talking until midnight, and most importantly, no mortgage. When I told the realtor I wanted to pay the full amount, she blinked, as if she didn't immediately realize I was serious. And then, when I signed the papers and the keys slid into my palm, her face froze in that same surprised smile that I'll probably never forget. It felt like a small victory that I had won, not on the battlefield, but in life. I couldn't help myself. As soon as I received the keys, I immediately took out my phone and started taking millions of photos. Every detail, the corner of the bedroom, the tiny balcony, the tiles in the bathroom, everything seemed so significant. I posted the pictures on social media, and my phone literally began vibrating with a stream of notifications, comments, and likes poured in one after another. "Congratulations, Julie, you deserve it, you're so great. When's the housewarming party?" I felt a warm wave of recognition and joy wash over me, and it was amazing to know that so many people were happy for me, genuinely, without envy, just with warmth in their hearts. But then the phone rang, and everything inside me sank. A name I hadn't seen in a long time appeared on the screen. "Dad." I froze, hesitating to press the accept button. His voice was dry, like sandpaper, as if the years that had passed between us had left their mark on his vocal cords. "Julie, I need you to come to dinner next Saturday," he said, without explaining why, without asking how I was. As if continuing a conversation that had never happened. That call brought back everything I had tried so hard to forget for so long. Because my mother had died when I was only 9, cancer hadn't just taken her away, it had destroyed our entire family, leaving a hole that no one had even tried to patch. Dad hadn't been alone for long. Just a year after the funeral, he married Sharon, a woman who made it clear from the first glance that there was no room for me in her home. And a year later, my half-sister was born, also named Sharon, as if the new wife had decided to cement her name forever by giving it to the child. I remember how it became clearer with each passing year. I was out of place here. Even before she had a child, I felt cold, but when the youngest Sharon came along, things got really bad. The rules suddenly started changing, not for everyone, just for me. "Julie, be quiet. Julie, don't bring your friends home. Julie, turn turn off the music, everything I did suddenly felt wrong. Meanwhile, my stepsister was getting everything: new toys, new furniture, better attention, and before she even had a chance to ask for anything, trips planned exclusively around her schedule. It was like I was a ghost in my own house, wandering the halls, trying not to breathe loudly, while Dad and Sharon took care of their precious daughter, as if I didn't exist. Sometimes I wondered if they even remembered that I lived here, that I was their daughter. At times like that, I thanked God for Grandma Margaret. I don't think I would have survived those years without her. Meanwhile, things were getting worse at my dad's house, and the atmosphere itself seemed to be permeated with a kind of viscous irritation, a cold dislike that was impossible to ignore but that no one would ever say out loud. My half-sister Amy, who had recently been an irritant with her moods, had gradually become a real nightmare, a little monster. With an angelic face that had poisonous teeth, she would hide my things, a favorite hair clip, a journal, my phone charger, and pretend she'd never seen them, then accidentally spill juice on my school projects, pretending not to notice the hours of work I'd put into them, and she'd even started spreading rumors about me at school, as if she got pleasure from ruining everything I cared about. And, as luck would have it, I was always the one to blame. "Julie, why are you upsetting your sister?" Dad asked with a reproachful voice, without waiting for my explanation, and even when I tried to defend myself, to tell how everything really happened, he only waved me off, and Sharon simply coldly said, "Julia, stop it." Dad did not even try to listen to my side, as if my voice had no weight, as if I was noise that interfered with their cozy family harmony. The day when I received the letter of acceptance to college was, perhaps, the happiest day of my life, and not at all because of the university itself, although the news about a partial scholarship was truly amazing, but because this letter meant one thing: I would finally be able to leave this house where I was not heard, not seen, and not wanted. The college was 3 states away from our home, and Grandma, as always, came to the rescue, adding everything necessary on top of the scholarship so that I could leave without looking back. College life was like a breath of fresh air after years underwater. I breathed freely. For the first time in many years I felt that I didn't have to be careful, that I could be myself. I threw myself into my studies, into books, into lectures and labs. I called my grandmother at least twice a week, and each time her voice brought back to me a sense of home, not the one I had left, but the real one, quiet, warm, loving. I almost stopped thinking about my father's family. He himself rarely called, and each call was dry, superficial, as if he were talking to a neighbor on the building, and not to his daughter. When he did call, his words revolved exclusively around Amy, his own daughter, as he liked to emphasize, and my attempts to tell something about my life were drowned in his absent-minded silence. After graduation, I had to move back to my home state because the offer from Thompson and Mills was too good to refuse: a stable job, a decent salary, a future. I naively thought that I could temporarily live with my father and Sharon until I got on my feet, but this turned out to be an illusion. Sharon, with her forced politeness, quickly ruined my plans. "Oh, we gave your room to Amy," she said, not a hint of regret in her voice. "She needs extra space for her things, you understand, right?" I stood there with the phone in my hand, trying to digest what I had heard, and in response, my father did not say a single word. No hint of protection, no desire to offer an alternative, nothing. Fortunately, my grandmother came to my rescue again. She met me at the gate of her house with open arms, as if I had returned not from another city, but from exile. I stayed with her until I got a new job, and after a few months I had saved enough to rent my own tiny apartment. It was cramped, but it was quiet, and that was already happiness. It was the first real home that belonged only to me. And then, a year ago, Grandma died. It was sudden, a stroke in her sleep, and maybe that was better than suffering, but for me, her passing was a terrible void. She left the house to my cousins, Jack and Emma and little Tommy, which made sense. They lived closer, always helping her with the housework, and I lived far away, visiting less often, no matter how hard I tried. But Grandma left me something else: $150,000, which she had saved her entire life, and in her will, she wrote, "For my granddaughter, who reminds me so much of her mother." The words were like a mother's touch, a gentle whisper from the past. Last year, my father had been quiet, almost out of my sight, his perfect family moving on with their lives, and, to be honest, that was fine with me. They didn't even invite me to Christmas. Not that that was unexpected. I spent it with Aunt Sarah and my cousins. And I must say it was the best Christmas I'd had in years, cozy, real, no pressure, no masks. And then that Saturday came. I drove to my dad's with a knot in my stomach, a buzz of anxiety, heavy breathing, and the closer I got to their neighborhood, the more my shoulders tightened, as if my body was trying to hide itself. I looked at my watch, 11:57, it was still a little early, but I'd better get there before I gave Sharon another reason to reproach me. I went to the door and rang the bell, silently counting the seconds, waiting for the sound of footsteps behind the wooden paneling. Dad opened the door, his face was stony, not the slightest hint of a greeting, just a dry come in, and he stepped aside, not looking me in the eye. They were all waiting in the living room. Sharon, as usual, was perched in her favorite chair, like a queen receiving a delegation, her posture exaggeratedly important. Amy was sprawled on the sofa, bent over the phone, and did not even look up at me. Sharon nodded, as if out of habit, not particularly acknowledging my presence. "Sit down," Dad said, pointing to the lonely chair opposite. It all felt less like a dinner party, more like a meeting, more like a family chat, more like preparation. For an interrogation, the silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and I could hear my stomach growling faintly with anxiety. Dad cleared his throat twice before he finally spoke. "Amy graduated," Dad said in the tone one usually uses when announcing the death of a distant relative or a sudden tax increase, as if it were urgent, life-changing news, and of course I was expected to receive it with the appropriate solemnity. "She got into a local college," he added, avoiding my gaze, looking somewhere past my head, as if there was a map of their ideal future hanging on the wall behind me. And every word he said was a waypoint. I nodded, not quite understanding where this was all leading, but feeling in my skin that the conversation was not at all for the sake of idle information, but something was definitely being prepared. I should have congratulated her, I muttered out loud, more to myself than to them. I even sent her a graduation present, even though I wasn't invited to the ceremony itself, I added with a slight bitterness, as if trying to save face in this strange game of silent reproaches. "It's sweet," I said carefully when it became clear that they were waiting for some kind of reaction, some kind of approval, something that I could perhaps no longer give. "She needs a place to live," Dad continued after another pause, with the same forced detachment that was more irritating than if he'd just yelled, "Somewhere near campus," he added, and I noticed Sharon nodding weakly in time with his words, like one of those little figures on a car dashboard that shakes its head in unison. With every turn of the wheel, Dad shifted in his seat, his face expressionless, but his hands fiddling nervously with the hem of his shirt. "Your apartment would be perfect," he said finally, as if tossing a stone into water and waiting to see what ripples it would cause. "It's perfectly located near the college." I felt the air around me grow cold, and the realization that something was about to be said that would change everything. "I'm not looking for a roommate," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, still trying to process what was happening, hoping that I was wrong, that this was just a misunderstanding, that they would laugh and say how stupid it was. Of course not, but Dad shook his head and, for the first time in the entire conversation, met my gaze. "You misunderstood, Julie," he said almost regretfully. "We're not asking you to let Amy live with you, we're asking you to give her your apartment." I laughed, a short, sharp sound that sounded so out of place in this room, in this family performance, that it died away when I saw their faces. They weren't kidding, they were serious, they were really serious. "Give her my apartment?" I asked, as if I couldn't trust my own ears. "You mean give up your house? The one I just bought? The one I saved up for years, denying myself literally everything?" "Yes," Dad said firmly, with the expression on his face that adults use when explaining simple things to a capricious child. "Amy needs it more than you do." I sat there, clutching the armrests, looking at them, wondering if I'd woken up in some alternate reality where everything I'd done had turned out to be nothing, and everything I'd achieved had just been a random mistake. My apartment, that same apartment, every inch of which was soaked in work, fears, hope, grandmother's inheritance, and they, so easily, without a shadow of a doubt, asked me to just give it away to this Amy, who until now refused to even look at me. "She deserves it more than you," Sharon said, her voice as saccharine as always, but with the same condescension she had spoken to me with since she entered my life. "She's been using me since I was 9, I thought," and out loud I said, "What have you done to deserve such a beautiful place?" To live all alone in a two-bedroom apartment, while my poor Amy has to think about student housing? I jumped up so fast that my chair almost toppled over, and the anger I had been holding back for years burst into my voice. Are you completely crazy? I won't give up my apartment, not now, not ever. This place is mine, I bought it with my own money. My father's face darkened, he exhaled slowly, and said with icy calm, your own money? Your grandmother gave you $150,000, Julie, that's hardly your own money. Something snapped inside me, everything I had saved up, not just money, but patience, strength, hope, crumbled in an instant. All these years I had kept silent, accepted their indifference, humiliation, tried to become better, to prove that I was worthy. Grandma was gone, and with her my only unconditional refuge. I laughed, hoarsely, brokenly, without a drop of humor. You mean my mother's mother? I said with emphasis, the woman who actually cared about me when you were too busy playing happy family with your new wife and daughter? That grandma who has nothing to do with Amy? And then Amy looked up from her phone, her face twisted into the familiar grimace from childhood, the one that always preceded her crocodile tears, theatrical sobs that everyone but me invariably fell for. You're such a terrible sister. She screamed, her lips trembling, her eyes starting to fill with water, but I didn't care anymore. You were always mean to me. You never loved me, Julie. Dad said in a hard, cutting voice, I'm so disappointed in you, we didn't raise you right. And then it all came out, you didn't raise me at all. I screamed, the words escaping from an open wound. You pulled the trigger on Mom dying and just moved Sharon into our house like nothing happened. Don't you dare talk to me about parenting. Don't you dare. I grabbed my purse, turned on my heel, and walked toward the door. My whole body was shaking like I'd been electrocuted. Behind me, I could hear Amy's theatrical sobs, high and piercing, practiced to the last detail, as if they'd been rehearsed in front of a mirror, followed by Sharon's consoling whispers, her voice artificially soft, cloying like cotton candy that tasted like sticky emptiness, and then my father's voice, muffled as if coming from the bottom of a well, calling my name, Julie, Julie, but I kept going, my legs carrying me away, every cell in my body screaming, go away, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I thought that this was the end. I really thought that I had finally broken free, that I had said everything that I had been holding back for years, that now there would be silence and freedom, but, alas, the peace turned out to be only a short respite. The next morning, my phone rang again, the name on the screen was Dad. Before I could even say hello, he began to speak, in a low voice, almost pleading, Julie, listen to me. His voice was tired but determined, as if he had been practicing all night to sound convincing. You're the big sister, you have to help Amy, that's what family does. I almost laughed, not with joy, but with bitter irony. Family? Now he wanted to talk about family? Where was all that nepotism when Sharon kicked me out of my own room, when Amy made my life hell with teenage ingenuity, when I wasn't even invited to Christmas even though I lived in the same town? This is different, he insisted, as if it could all be erased. You have to be reasonable, Amy miss, you're crazy, I interrupted, my voice cold as metal. You're crazy, actually, if you think I'm going to give up my apartment to a man who spent his entire life trying to hurt me. Don't call me about this again. I hit end call with icy certainty, but as expected, it wasn't the end, just a new phase of madness. A few minutes later, my phone began to vibrate with a stream of messages, long, accusatory ones, from Sharon, with her usual veil of concern. You were always jealous of Amy, you're as selfish and ungrateful as your mother, after everything we've done for you. I stared at the screen, watching the words fill the lines, but I felt no anger or pain, just a strange, heavy, yet cleansing sense of calm. Dad kept calling all day, leaving voicemails where his voice sounded increasingly irritated, less and less fatherly. But I didn't answer anymore. What's the point of a conversation if it just goes around in circles, returning to the same demand, give up your house? My house, I give it up, the guilt, this eternal stumbling over family obligations that have always been a one-way street for me. A week after this confrontation, I finally decided to do what I'd been putting off, throw a housewarming party, my apartment filled with people I'd chosen to be a part of my life, co-workers with whom we'd laughed at lunch and supported each other through stressful days, old college friends with whom we'd shared late-night shifts before exams, and, of course, my favorite cousins. the rooms filled with the sound of genuine laughter, easy conversations, joy, and it all felt like some kind of cleansing ritual, as if with every word, with every smile, all the toxicity that had hung over my past was being washed away. "Julie," Emma called from the kitchen, "we're running low on ice." I headed for the freezer, still smiling warmly at this point, but before I got there, Jack, my cousin, grabbed my hand. His face was tense, serious, and it was immediately noticeable, because he was usually the life of the party, the family clown, the one who always jokes and smiles. "Hey, I need to show you something," he said quietly, looking around, and led me into the hallway, out of sight and ears. "You might want to sit down," he added, and I, already wary, sank onto the edge of my brand new gray ottoman that I had only recently unpacked. Jack pulled out his phone, hesitated for a moment, as if he was unsure whether to do so, and then silently handed me the screen. "I was at Lorenzo's last night with some friends," he began, "and, look who I saw in the background." I picked up my phone, and a photo popped up on the screen in front of me. My heart stopped for a split second, and everything around me seemed to freeze. It was a dark restaurant, the lights were dim, the booths were cozy, and in one of them sat Sharon, my stepmother. But she wasn't alone. A man I'd never seen before sat next to her, his arm around her shoulders, and they were kissing. Not a friendly kiss, it was the kind of kiss that leaves no room for doubt, either in context or in feeling. "Here's another," Jack said quietly, and began to flip through the photos, one after another. Sharon laughing, her hand on a man's chest, him feeding her dessert with a spoon, their fingers intertwined on the table, intimate, familiar, the way people had done it 1,000 times before. I watched, unblinking, and couldn't believe that this was really happening, that I was looking at my stepmother, the woman who had insisted time and time again that her family was perfect, flawless, holy. I felt my insides twist. "I know I shouldn't have taken pictures," Jack said, but he held out his phone to me like a weapon. "Send them to me," I asked quietly, almost in a whisper, looking not at the screen but into the void, trying to figure out what to do with this knowledge. After the party was over and my last guest had left, I was left alone in the quiet, empty apartment. I sat in my darkened living room, the dishes freshly washed in the sink, the scents of the evening still lingering in the air, but I heard and felt nothing but my heart pounding in my chest as I looked at the pictures Jack had sent me. My fingers nervously scrolled across the screen of my phone, my eyes latching on to every detail, and with each new picture, not just a story but a revelation unfolded before me, as if I had been handed the key to a secret room that had been hidden behind a decent family screen for all these years. "Who is this man?" I whispered to myself, but the whisper grew louder and louder until it turned into an internal scream. I needed to know. And I didn't have to look far. Sharon had never been particularly careful, and perhaps she had become accustomed to the fact that none of us asked unnecessary questions, did not look deeper than what she showed the world. He was right there, on her Facebook friends list, with a plain, unremarkable profile photo and a name that immediately stuck in my mind, Robert Mitchell. I clicked on his profile, and the next second I felt the world tilt beneath me, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. And the ground had suddenly cracked. Robert Mitchell had worked at Riverside Insurance for 20 years, the same company where Sharon worked, the same company she'd worked for before she married my father. I started scrolling through his photos, digging deeper into the past, like an archaeologist uncovering layer after layer of someone else's life. There were pictures of company picnics, office parties, Christmas gatherings, summer barbecues, innocuous-looking pictures, but each one screaming something no one wanted to see. Her in many of them, sometimes in the background, with a glass of wine, sometimes barely visible, on the border between light and shadow. But I knew her. I would have recognized her among 1,000. It was Sharon. 20 years of photographs showing a relationship that had long since gone beyond simple politeness between colleagues. I stopped at one old photograph, 15 years old, and my heart twitched again. A woman in a red dress sat on a park bench next to Robert. Her face was turned away from the camera, but I knew that hairstyle, that silhouette, that curve of her shoulders. The caption under the photo read, "Perfect Sunday." That red dress was still hanging in Sharon's closet. And this photo was taken 3 years after her wedding to my father. I opened a new tab, continuing my search. I wanted to find more recent pictures of Robert, to see if he had changed, how he lived now. and when his face appeared in front of me, clear, in good light, a smile, the expression in his eyes, it struck me like an electric shock. I couldn't look away. Those eyes, that nose. The way the corners of his mouth curled up even when he wasn't smiling. I slowly pulled out my phone, opened a recent photo of Amy, and held it up to the screen. It was like a mirror. The resemblance wasn't just obvious, it was frightening. How had I not noticed it before? Amy didn't look anything like my father, not in her features, not in her personality, not in the way she spoke, but she was practically a carbon copy of Robert Mitchell. The truth burned in my chest for 2 days. I carried this knowledge with me, my heart skipping a beat every time I opened the photo album on my phone. I was literally sickened by the realization of the enormity of the lie that had been going on for 20 years, this whole performance, this whole fiction that I was forced to believe in. And my father, was he blind, deaf, or just pretending? When his number came back on my phone, I almost threw the phone down, but something inside me, maybe some residual respect, maybe some anger that needed an outlet, made me answer. Julie, he began, in the tone he always used when he wanted to sound like a father, like an authority, like the final voice of reason. We need to have a serious talk. Come over to our house. I wanted to shout it all out right now, spill the beans. Sharon's 20-year affair, her lover, Amy's real father, but something stopped me. Maybe it was intuition. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said coldly. They were waiting for me in the living room, like in a theater before a drama, just Sharon and Dad. This time he didn't even try to soften the situation. Sit down, Julie, he commanded, pointing to a chair, and I obeyed. For the last time impersonating the obedient daughter they wanted to see, he began without preamble, his voice harsh, his steps confident. Your behavior is disappointing, he said, pacing in front of the fireplace like a prosecutor in court. This selfishness, this refusal to help your sister, it all has to end. I looked at Sharon, she nodded, as always, with that same expression on her face, as if everything that was happening was something obvious, logical, deserved. I almost threw up at her hypocrisy, at her ability to sit there, demanding that I give up my apartment to her illegitimate daughter, passed off as my father's own. I felt a calm come over me, cold and decisive, and a decision was born inside me. Dad continued to speak in his hard voice, not giving me a chance to get a word in edgewise. Either you sign over your apartment to Amy, or I'm cutting you out of the will entirely. No inheritance, no family money, nothing. Sharon's face lit up with triumph, her lips stretching into that thin smile that always preceded a triumphant sigh, and she cocked her head to the side, as if watching the last act of a play, where the heroine finally conceded defeat. They really thought they had me cornered, that now I would swallow the humiliation as I always did, pretend to understand, bend under the weight of family obligations, and give up with relief what I had worked for my entire adult life. I forced myself to feign confusion, bit my lip slightly, lowered my eyes to the floor and whispered, I need to think about it. Dad nodded, smiling a little softer, like a trainer confident that the tiger has finally been tamed. Good girl, he said, and for the first time in a long time his voice softened, something almost paternal appeared in it. You just need a little time to think about what's really important. But could I? Could I use their own confidence against them? This shameless self-confidence, this contempt for my will and reason? Inspired by an internal decision, I quietly asked if I could use the bathroom, deliberately making my voice a little weak, uncertain, as if I were trembling with tears. Dad waved his hand dismissively, not really looking at me, and I hurried upstairs. But instead of turning into the bathroom, I slipped silently, like a shadow, into Amy's room, her old room, which she had painted pink, turning into a glossy doll's box, as perfect and soulless as the rest of her life. On the dressing table lay a hairbrush, thick with long dark strands, and I knew for a second that those strands of hair were hers, and they were just like Robert Mitchell's. My hands were shaking as I took a small plastic bag out of my pocket, bent down, and carefully, gently gathered up a few strands, being careful not to disturb the order. Then I crept just as silently into my father's bedroom. There, on the dresser, in the same place it always was, sat his hairbrush, next to a dusty wedding photograph of him and Sharon holding hands, pretending to be a happy family. The irony was not lost on me. I gathered up some of his hair into another bag, putting all the determination and anger that had been building for years into the movement. That evening, I spent several hours online researching DNA testing facilities, not the ones advertised on YouTube, but certified labs whose reports could be used in court. It wasn't cheap, nearly $2,000 for rush processing and official verification, but I didn't hesitate, it was worth every penny. The next morning, I walked into the clinic with two carefully labeled plastic bags. A woman in a white coat, with professional politeness and a friendly smile, explained the procedure, gave me paperwork to sign, assured me it would be confidential, and promised that the results would be ready in a few weeks. The results came in a plain white envelope, no logos, no warnings. I held it in my hands, my heart pounding in my throat, my hands shaking, despite the fact that I already knew what would be written there. The medical language was dry, I would even say soulless. The alleged father is excluded from the list of biological fathers of the child being tested. The probability of paternity is 0%. I read this phrase over and over again, and each repetition brought relief, as if the stone that had been pressing on my chest began to slowly melt. All this time, I was not going crazy. I knew, I felt. When the phone rang, and Sharon's name appeared on the screen, I almost laughed. I answered calmly, "We are tired of waiting," she said sharply, wasting no time on formalities. "Hello, your father and I want you to make a decision about the apartment in the next few days, otherwise, you can say goodbye to your inheritance." Her voice was cold as ice, enveloping as poison. I tried to speak evenly, as if discussing the weather. "Actually, I've thought about everything. I'm coming to dinner this Saturday, we'll talk it over." On Saturday night, I went to their house again, but this time the knot in my stomach wasn't from fear or anxiety, but from anticipation. In my purse, safely hidden among the papers, was a white envelope, a silent weapon, the last word. They were all in the living room, like actors preparing for the final exit. Sharon was beaming, as if she'd just won a battle, her face pulled into a triumphant grin. Amy was sprawled on the couch, looking at her manicure with demonstrative laziness, throwing quick, condescending glances in my direction. Father stood by the fireplace, as if rehearsing the pose of terrible, but fair, but satisfaction still seeped out from under the mask of severity. Finally, Amy was the first to break the silence. "It took you long enough to make the right decision." Her voice was filled with triumph. Dad came up to me, put his hand on my shoulder, as if blessing. "I'm glad you changed your mind, Julie. This is what family is all about, helping each other." I shrugged, moving away from his hand. "I haven't changed my mind. I'm not giving up my apartment, not now, not ever, selfish brat." I threw the last words at Amy, looking her straight in the eyes. Father's face turned red with rage. "That's it," he roared, "you're out of the will. Everything goes to Amy, my own daughter, the one who truly understands what family loyalty means." I couldn't hold back. A laugh burst from my lips, loud and clear and desperate and liberating. The sound echoed off the walls, and everyone fell silent, staring at me as if I had suddenly gone mad. I sat up straight, my voice calm and clear. "Your real daughter?" I asked, with a hint of mockery. I reached into my purse. "That's interesting, Dad, because I have something you need to see." I pulled out a white envelope and handed it to him. He snatched it from my hand with such haste, as if he already sensed that it contained the destruction of all his past certainties. Glaring at me as he tore at the edge and pulled out the papers with the same mixture of impatience and anger I remembered from my childhood. "Read it," I said quietly, but there was steel in every sound of my words. "Read it out loud." He began to read. At first his voice sounded confident, firm, as if he were looking over another report from work, but as he swallowed the lines, the usual intonations began to disappear. His face grew pale with each new sentence, his eyes darted over the document, and then, when he reached the decisive line, the color finally drained from his cheeks, his hands began to tremble. The paper in them began to crunch with tension, as if even she felt that destruction was inevitable. Sharon made a hoarse, squeezed sound, as if someone had punched her in the stomach, and this moment became the collapse of her theater for her. "It's a lie," she screamed, her face distorted in panic. There was no longer a trace of her usual haughty calm. "She forged these documents. She's trying to turn you against me. Against us." Her voice broke, trembled, and there was no longer power in it, only fear. I didn't answer right away, just silently pulled my phone out of my purse as she continued to scream about forgery, about conspiracy, about revenge. My fingers trembled slightly, but I confidently opened the folder with the photos Jack had taken. "Look," I said only that, and the room became so silent that it seemed as if you could hear the time passing. On the screen were pictures: Sharon, caught in an intimate embrace with Robert Mitchell, the date and time just a week ago. She was laughing, her hand on his chest, their lips pressed together in a kiss, their fingers intertwined. These were not casual touches. This was the language of intimacy, the language of love, practiced for years. Sharon collapsed onto the couch, her mask of superiority cracking. David, please. I can explain, she stammered, her voice no longer commanding, but pleading. Explain, her father roared, his voice echoing through the walls, and we all flinched. Explain what? For how long? He stepped forward, his face flushing. 20 years, she whispered, as if confessing a sin before the sentence. He's my colleague at Riverside, Amy. Robert is her father. And then there was silence, real silence, heavy, painful. I watched my father as he stood there, unblinking, as if his world had just crumbled beneath his feet. 20 years of lies, betrayal, deceit, and he didn't even know it was a child he was raising that wasn't his. I didn't say a word, I just grabbed my purse and walked out of the house, leaving them there in the ruins of their little fairy tale that no one had ever invited me into. The next week passed in a blur. I'd wake up, drive to work, come home, and stare at the ceiling again, trying to process everything that had happened. I'd been told, through coworkers and old acquaintances, that Sharon and Amy had moved out, that my father had hired the best divorce lawyer in town, and that the scandal had spread through their social circle faster than fire through dry grass. All the people who had once praised Sharon for her elegance were now whispering quietly by the coffee machines. When my dad's number popped up on my phone a week later, I almost didn't pick it up, but something, maybe curiosity, maybe a lingering hope, made me hit answer. Can we meet? He asked, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't slept for several nights. We met at a corner table by the window at Carson's. He sat staring into his cold coffee, looking not a week but a decade older. His shoulders were hunched, his cheeks were sunken, and the wedding ring was missing from his finger. I filed for divorce, he said without preamble. Sharon and Amy are gone. I told them to get out of my house, and I stopped paying for Amy's college. Why should I pay for another man's child? I stirred my latte, waiting for him to say more. Julie, his voice faltered, and he looked into my eyes. I was a terrible father, yes, I said quietly, looking straight at him. You were, all this time. He nodded. I valued Amy more than you. I let Sharon treat you like a stranger in your own home. I didn't protect you, I didn't support you, I failed you in every way. You did, I agreed, and you would never have realized it if you hadn't known about Amy. If she really had been your daughter, you would have still given her my apartment, without a second thought. He winced at my words, but he didn't deny it. He just slowly reached his hand across the table, as if to touch it, but I pulled mine back before his fingers could touch mine. Please, he whispered, his voice almost childish, please give me a chance to make this right. Let me at least try to be the father you deserved from the beginning. That was 3 months ago. Now we meet occasionally, coffee, lunch, careful conversations about safe topics, the weather, work, memories of my mother he's never spoken of before. He asks about my life, about my friends, inquires about my career, asks if I've found someone special. He's trying to make it up to me, but full forgiveness I'm not there yet. Maybe I never will be. 20 years of rejection and neglect are scars that don't heal overnight, if at all. As for Sharon and Amy, I hear about them in passing, through gossip, word as they've moved in with Robert Mitchell. I imagine they're now living the life they may have been secretly building all this time. But to be honest, I don't care. They're not part of my story anymore. That chapter is closed, forever.